All right, welcome to the deep dive. So, spring is here, and with it comes Easter. And with Easter, a question we see pop up quite a bit, the resurrection of Christ. You guys sent in a bunch of really interesting sources that look at, whether it's a historical event that literally happened and changed the course of history, or if it's more of a symbolic narrative that has deep meaning, maybe spiritual, maybe philosophical. So we're going to
Sure.
try to dig into all of that today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the big question your sources are grappling with is the resurrection an actual historical fact that shaped history? Or is it, like you were saying, kind of a powerful story that offers some, I don't know, deeper spiritual and philosophical insights, regardless of whether it actually happened? So we're going to try to
Yep.
unpack both of those sides of the coin.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So let's start with, the literal resurrection. Why is that belief so important for a lot of Christians, according to your sources?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because your sources really point to this idea that it kind of underpins their whole faith. The resurrection is seen as proof that Christ was divine and that his promises, especially the promise of eternal life, are true. It's kind of a foundational thing for a lot of key Christian doctrines like salvation and the idea of conquering death. So, yeah, theologically, it's hugely important.
So, taking a step back, your sources also touch on Easter as a sort of broader commemoration, right? Like beyond the maybe historical miracle, can it also be, I don't know, a symbol of hope and renewal that speaks to a wider audience?
Yeah, absolutely. If you think about it, the core themes of Easter rebirth, new beginnings, overcoming darkness, they're pretty universal, right? They resonate with people from all sorts of backgrounds, not just those who follow a specific religion.
Yeah.
And of course, spring itself is all about renewal and starting fresh. So yeah, Easter definitely has a broader appeal.
Okay, so one thing that really stood out in your sources was the whole issue of evidence, or I guess the lack of direct historical evidence for the resurrection. How does that, challenge people's faith, and does it maybe lead to different ways of interpreting the story?
That's a really interesting point. And your sources suggest it kind of cuts to the heart of what faith is all about. For some people, that lack of concrete proof means they have to make a leap of faith, so to speak. They got to trust without necessarily having empirical validation. But for others, it might actually push them to look for deeper meaning within the story itself, to focus on its symbolic power rather than getting hung up on the literal truth.
So what are some of those, I don't know, deeper meanings? When you look at the resurrection, beyond just the historical event, what do your sources highlight as particularly significant?
I think the big one that jumps out is the idea of overcoming adversity. Your sources argue that the resurrection narrative can be really powerful as a symbol of personal transformation, of resilience in the face of suffering, and the enduring possibility of a brighter future, regardless of whether it literally happened. It taps into a fundamental human hope, right?
And your sources talk a lot about the evolution of Easter, too. It's a major religious holiday, obviously, but it's also become a big cultural thing, especially in the springtime.
Exactly. And I think that just shows how powerful those underlying themes are. Even if you're not religious, the imagery and the overall feeling of renewal and optimism that comes with Easter, it still holds cultural weight, right? It contributes to a shared experience.
And going back to that metaphor idea, your sources make a case for the resurrection as a really strong metaphor for, I don't know, our own personal struggles and that constant drive for growth. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. When you see the resurrection metaphorically, it allows for a much more personal connection, right? It's like a mirror to our own capacity to face challenges, to learn from setbacks, and to keep striving for positive change in our lives, kind of like our own personal resurrection from tough times.
Right, right. And finally, your sources also get into like the emotional comfort that the belief in the resurrection can offer, especially for people who are dealing with grief or hardship.
Yeah, the psychological impact is undeniable. Your sources suggest that this belief can give people a framework for understanding suffering and loss. It offers a sense of hope, even peace, when facing some of life's biggest challenges. For a lot of people, it's a huge slice of comfort.
And on the flip side, do your sources say that like focusing so much on the, literal historical truth of the resurrection,
Right.
could that sometimes overshadow those deep emotional and philosophical messages that are in there?
Yeah, it's definitely something to consider. Your sources do suggest that for some, getting too hung up on the historical details might distract from the really rich ethical, spiritual, and emotional insights within the story itself. It's about finding that balance.
Okay, so, wrapping up this deep dive into the sources you guys sent in, I think we've seen that there are so many different ways to look at the resurrection of Christ historically.
from a faith perspective, culturally, and even metaphorically. Whether you believe it was a pivotal historical event or a really powerful symbolic narrative, the themes of hope, renewal, and overcoming challenges are clearly still resonating with a lot of people today. And hopefully, all this gives you some food for thought as you continue to explore these ideas and what they mean to you. What aspects of this discussion stand out to you? And what new questions are you left with?